ברגע זה אנו עוברים את שער האריות. אנחנו בתוך העיר העתיקה. אנחנו בתוך העיר העתיקה.
הר הבית בידינו, כאן תלמיד, הר הבית בידינו. ראש שריף קיבלנו, כל הכבוד, כל הכבוד. חדל, חדל, כל הכוחות חדל. מנחם ציון ובונה ירושלים.
Shalom. What a chilling film to watch of us capturing, the Jewish people recapturing or liberating the Temple Mount. And guess what? One of those soldiers, one of the tzanchanim, the paratroopers, who liberated the Temple Mount was no other than Rabbi Yisrael Ariel, the head of the Temple Institute, Mechon HaMikdash. He was one of those paratroopers that fought his way onto Har HaBayit, onto the Temple Mount. Many of his friends didn't make it. They were actually killed on Har HaBayit. But Rav Ariel, thank God, he made it, and he was one of those that liberated the Temple Mount. That evening, after liberating the Temple Mount in 1967, Rabbi Yisrael Ariel, as a soldier, was given the task to actually guard the area where the Holy of Holies is on the Temple Mount. Imagine that. After 2,000 years, this falls on your head to watch the area of the Holy of Holies. That night, Rav Ariel said he was alone with his thoughts, and he realized at one point that he's next to the Holy of Holies. And he said he started to shake all over. And he got scared, and he said, am I allowed to be here? And then he went further with his thoughts, and he said, what are our obligations now that we have captured the Temple Mount? What do we need to do as the Jewish people? We waited for this. We prayed for this. We begged for this. And suddenly, we got it. And it was a miracle. And what is our obligation now, this day, today, to do? And the answer, obviously, was to build the temple, was to rebuild the temple, the third Beit HaMikdash. And yet we haven't built it. Why? 53 years later, we haven't built the temple. And I'm sure everyone who is watching this video is wondering to themselves, why haven't we built the temple? It literally, in terms of the mitzvot, in terms of the commandments in the Torah, there's at least 1/3 of the mitzvot, of the commandments in the Torah, are connected to the Temple Mount. Why wouldn't we want to build this temple? For 2,000 years we're saying, Sheyibana Beit HaMikdash, may the Beit HaMikdash, may the temple be rebuilt. And suddenly, it's here, it's ours. And why haven't we built it? Good question, correct? Okay, so on the one hand, we can look at the government of Israel, and we understand on a very simple level that the government of Israel is a secular government. And the Prime Minister of Israel is a secular Jew. And certainly they don't keep the commandments, unfortunately, and it's almost, we can't expect them to build a temple which is completely spiritual and a religious thing. So on the one hand, we can't expect that the government of Israel, which is secular, is going to build our temple for us. Even though in history, we see that Herod, who was a terrible, terrible king, evil, evil person who killed a lot of people, a lot of Jews, a lot of rabbis. But he did assist in rebuilding the temple towards the end of the Second Temple period. And actually the Talmud says that those were good times for the Jews. That even though this person was a secular person, and he was a bad person, by just rebuilding the temple, it brought so much good to the world. And that's actually in the Gemara, in the Talmud, in Ta'anit, it actually says that we see by Hordus, when they were involved in building the temple, that the rain would come down at night while they weren't working, and then by the morning the wind had blown it away, and the clouds have gone, and they were ready to work again. And they knew that Melechet Shamayim Biyadehem, that God wanted their work. So even Hordus, a bad guy, who's completely secular, obviously, he did build a temple. So on a certain level, no excuses, even for the government of Israel. But to be fair to those in power, one has to assume that they're deferring to the Rabbanut HaRashit, the chief rabbinate of Israel. The chief rabbinate is what represents, is the government body that represents anything to do with religion in the country. And unfortunately, they too are at fault for not building the temple. And the question is why? Now, what they do say is, interesting enough, it's not the right time. We have to wait for Messiah, or it's going to come from the heavens. Now, it didn't say that in the Torah. In the Torah, it says, "V'asu lemigdash v'shachanti betocham." Very simple pasuk. I think anyone can understand that. Make me a temple, and I will dwell, my Shechina, my presence, my spiritual divine presence, God is saying, will dwell amongst you. Very simple verse. And yet they say it's not the right time. Now, when you read the Bible and you read Haggai, I'm not sure how you say Haggai in English, but he's one of the 12 prophets. And he says, right at the beginning of Haggai, I think there's only 3 chapters in Haggai, maybe 2, I don't remember. But Haggai says to the people, he gives them musar. He tells them off, he rebukes them. And he says, Ha'am hazeh amru, the people are saying, Lo ed bo ed bait Hashem lihibanot, which means is the people are saying it's not time to build the temple. And they got punished for that. If you read the verses over there, you'll see the Jews got punished for saying that. I don't want to think about the punishments perhaps that we are receiving because we're not building the temple. But once again, what is going on here? These are great rabbis. And they are meant to represent Torah. So what is going on? Why are they not building this temple today? It's a good question, right? We have to think about that. So I'm going to tell you something. It's an interesting thing. It's a certain syndrome that these rabbis are suffering from. And it's something very important to understand. It's called the Gullus syndrome, the exile syndrome. You know, for 2,000 years, the Jews have been stuck in galut. They've been stuck in exile. And they've gone from pogrom to pogrom, to being kicked out from one country to the next. You know, you suffer a lot over 2,000 years of not being in your own country. And I suppose they've fallen into this trap of thinking themselves as Gullus Jews, as exiled Jews, even though they're living in Israel. And what happens is, because they're Gullus Jews, they have an inability to process the miracles of 1967. And I'm going to just say something here. I don't want to dwell on the negativity here. I want to more, as you know, I want to dwell on the positivity and the temple. But I feel almost obligated to say this, that the current chief rabbi of Israel himself has made a comment that is almost inexcusable, unconscionable to make such a comment, where he told a student who wrote him a letter. His name was Aryeh Lapo, Rav Aryeh Lapo, and wrote a letter to the chief rabbi of Israel, and he asked him, why don't we build the temple? And his response was, we're not going to build a temple until Mashiach comes. And he says, don't even involve yourself in learning anything about the temple, lest you see a reason that we can build it today. That's the prevailing attitude of the chief rabbinate. That is not the Torah attitude, but rather that's the attitude of the chief rabbinate. And unfortunately, this has nothing to do with Jewish thinking. It has nothing to do with Eretz Yisrael thinking, and has nothing to do with our redemption, our geula thinking. And essentially, it is Gullus thinking, it is exile thinking. And you almost have to have pity on these rabbis, because I think they're held hostage by the darkness of galut that we had for so many years, and it's very hard for them to extricate themselves from after being stuck in this for over 2,000 years. It's just very hard, I think, to move on. Recognize that we're in a redemptive period. We're 7 million Jews, 7 million Jews are living in this country. We must build the temple. Now, Rav Ariel, one of the psukim, one of the verses Rav Ariel takes to heart is a verse in Mishlei. And the verse is, Peti yamin l'chol davar, the fool believes everything. Rav Ariel was aware of this ideology, if we'll call it, this belief system, this gullus belief system, this exile belief system. But he said, you know, I have to check the sources myself. I'm not willing to accept what they're saying. Why? Very simply, because the verse says, V'asu li migdash, v'shachanti b'tocha, make me a mikdash. God wants a mikdash. So how could this be that we're not building it? We captured Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount. That was but a dream, and yet it happened. So Ariel decided to research and look at all these sources. And his conclusion was, based on all the sources, both medieval and post-medieval sources, that there is a mitzvah in the Torah to build the Beit HaMikdash today. And that's pretty much what propelled the Rav to open the Machon and to build all the kelim of the Mikdash. People wonder when they give money to Machon HaMikdash, where does that money go? I'm going to tell you where that money goes, because it's not going in the pockets of the people who are working there. That's for sure. It's going into the vessels, creating the vessels for the Mikdash, for the temple. And that's what the Rav dedicated himself for the last 30 plus years to building those vessels. And many of them are expensive. We talked about gold. Those are expensive vessels. And they've published tremendous amount of works on the halachot, the laws of the Mikdash. Anything to do from the avoda to making the different vessels, you name it. They've written it. They've written on it, sorry. So when the Rav looked at the halachot and all the sources, he realized everyone agrees you have to build it. Now, but he had to deal with the Rabbanut, with the chief rabbinate. Yet there are these rabbis that are still mired in their gullus thinking, in their exile thinking, and are not willing to accept that. So the Rav came to a conclusion, and he said to himself, you know, there's a famous Gemara. And the Gemara says that the Nachash, the serpent, who caused Adam and Chava to sin, was in the end punished. God punished the serpent. And the Gemara says actually that the serpent had a really good excuse that he could have used. He got punished for other reasons. But he actually had a very good excuse that he could have said to God that would sort of protect him and save him. In other words, don't blame me for causing Chava and Adam to eat the fruit. And he could have said, Divrei harav, v'divrei hatalmid, divrei mishomin. The words of the master and the words of the student, who do you listen to? And what that means is, God is the Rav, God is the master. And the student, well, that would be the Nachash. And the Nachash would be saying to Chava and Adam, God told you something to do. Why are you listening to me? Rav Ariel took a similar idea. And I think all those involved in the Mikdash today take a similar idea. God said, build him a temple. The Rabbanut are the Talmidim, they're the students. And although we want to give them tremendous honor, and I actually think the Rabbanut on a certain level is very, very important. We all do. Because we sort of see it as transitioning into potentially and hopefully the Sanhedrin. But for now, they're still taking that gullus position. And Rav Ariel said, I have to listen to God. And therefore, and God commands us to build a temple, and that's what all the sources indicate, I'm going to go with that. And that's why the Rav went on his, we'll call it his journey, to build a Mikdash, and they have continued with it, and more join. You know, sometimes you have to take an unpopular track. And the reason you take it is because you see the truth, you see the emes. And you have to follow the truth even though you see others don't agree with you. And I actually want to quote Mark Twain. Mark Twain had a great line when he said, whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it is time to pause and reflect. Okay? He didn't say you go against the majority, just pause and reflect. So we're going to pause and reflect. Even in Torah issues, sometimes the consensus can be wrong. And I think one of the best examples of that is actually in the Torah. And that's the miraglim, the spies. The miraglim were comprised of the greatest of the leaders of the Jewish people at that time. They were considered the gedolim, the greats of Torah, were the miraglim, were the spies. And yet we all know from reading the Bible that 10 of them said, we don't want Eretz Yisrael. We don't want Israel. It's not good. Only 2, the minority, Caleb ben Yefuneh from the tribe of Judah and Yeshua ben Nun from the tribe of Ephraim. Only those 2 did not join the consensus. And the rallying cry of Caleb was, Tova haaretz me'od me'od. No, Eretz Yisrael is very, very good. And here's an interesting Talmudic line from Sanhedrin, in Tractate Sanhedrin. Caleb ben Yefuneh had another name. His other name was Mered, which means rebellion. And the Gemara says, Mered ze Caleb. Mered was Caleb. Why is it called Mered? Why is it called rebellion? V'lama nikra shmo Mered. Why is it called Mered? And here's the point. Shemared ba'atzat miraglim. He rebelled against the counsel of the spies. Sometimes you have to rebel against that consensus because it's wrong and because it's not our destiny. It's not where we're meant to be. And our belief is that we have to build the temple. We need to build it today. And there are times that we must rebel against the prevailing thinking that runs counter to our Torah. And I think we have to pity those rabbis in the Rabbanut, or those that take a position against building the temple today. We have to find pity for them. We don't have to get angry, but we have to find pity for them. Because they fail to recognize and appreciate our 2,000-year dream that has already materialized here in the land of Israel. And we have an obligation now to God to do His will. And His will is to build Him a temple. V'asu li migdash v'shachanti b'tocham. So I ask you to join us at the Temple Institute, Mechon Migdash. Join the rebellion. Join the temple rebellion, the Mikdash rebellion. Mikdash achshav, Mikdash now. We want it now, not to wait. We're not interested in waiting till Mashiach. Nowhere in the Torah does it say that we need to wait for Mashiach to build the temple. The Torah tells us very explicitly, build God a home. We want to build Him a home. Thank you.